most of you, but just in case, I am a professor of economics at Spelman College and also the co-director of the Retirement and Disability Research Center at the National Bureau of Economic Research. So this workshop is one of a series that we hope to kick off this year and also in future years. And we're grateful to the Social Security Administration for funding both our center and this workshop. So it's going to be specifically on retirement and Social Security issues, and we're grateful to have Gopi Shah Goda, who is a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute of Economic Policy Research and also a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, who will be leading us through this workshop. So just a couple of points of administrative order. So you know, we will be recording this, one for people who are not able to attend today, and also those of you in attendance who might want to watch it back. So this will be posted in the future on the RDRC website at NBER under the Resources tab. And then the second point is that Gopi will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes. And if you have any questions throughout, just drop them in chat. We will collect all of these, and then she will respond to them on the back end. So don't be shy about throwing your questions in chat and make sure that we have them. So without further ado, in the interest of time, let me hand the mic over to Gopi. Gopi, thanks again for doing this. We all look forward to learning a lot from your knowledge today.
Thank you so much, Angelina, for the introduction and for the opportunity to tell you all a little bit about Social Security. So I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully we are good to go.
Yes, we see it.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to spend most of my time today talking about Social Security and how it works, what the benefits, how they're calculated, how it affects different kinds of incentives, and end with a few notes on some data sources that could be valuable and also some areas that are ripe for further research. But I want to start by giving a bit of an overview of just where Social Security is situated in terms of the complete U.S. retirement system. And the two other major sources of retirement income are from defined benefit pensions and defined contribution pensions. And so I wanted to give a bit of information about each of these three different sources of retirement support and talk about how they're similar and also how they're different. So, of course, one major difference between Social Security and these other programs is Social Security is a federal program that requires contributions from working years and earnings and is financed through a mandatory payroll tax, while defined benefit pensions and defined contribution plans are optional plans that employers can offer if they choose to do so. And therefore, Social Security is kind of the one thing that most people in the U.S. are eligible to receive in retirement. When I say most, it covers about 93% of workers, and there are some workers who are working either for state and local governments who are not a part of Social Security, but by and large, all private sector employees do contribute to the program. The way that Social Security is financed is through a 12.4% payroll tax. Part of this goes to fund disability insurance benefits, which I know is the subject of a whole nother meeting in a few weeks, and is not something that I'll be covering in any detail today. But that does include both the DI portion and the retirement benefits portion. And it's actually evenly split between workers and their employers. But most economists agree that workers bear both parts of that payroll tax in terms of reduced wages. And in fact, self-employed workers pay the full 12.4% payroll tax. Defined benefit pensions are funded through contributions made usually by the employer, sometimes also by the employee, whereas defined contribution plans are funded through a mix of employer and employee contributions. that often receive some kind of tax preference. So in terms of Social Security, you can think of it in a few different ways of how many people are part of the program. If you count everyone who's both contributing and receiving benefits for the program, it's many more than what I'm showing as the number of beneficiaries. But we have 52.7 million beneficiaries currently receiving retirement benefits, and another 5.8 million beneficiaries receive survivor benefits, and another 8.5 million beneficiaries are receiving disability benefits. In defined benefit pensions, there's actually been quite a reduction in the number of participants in defined benefit pension plans, and I'll talk about that in 1 minute. In defined contribution plans, there's almost 88 million active participants in these types of plans currently. So just a word of background in terms of the defined benefit, defined contribution shift over the years. So it used to be that defined benefit pensions were the dominant form of employer pension plans. In 1974, there was new legislation that increased protections of workers in the wake of some high-profile bankruptcies of defined benefit pension plans. And the idea was to make those pension plans stronger and less liable to leave workers unprotected from their pensions, but really kind of paved the way for defined contribution plans to become more and more popular ways that employers provided ways to save for retirement. So again, this is just an overview, and I know there's a lot on this page, but we'll go through Social Security in a lot more detail. To be eligible for Social Security benefits, you must work in Social Security covered employment for at least 10 years to receive retirement benefits. You can claim these benefits at what's sometimes referred to as an early retirement age, but you can't borrow against these benefits or claim them at a deeper discount prior to that point. The benefits are based on an earnings history, what age you claim the benefits, and there's still some other factors, and we'll go through those in detail. But these are paid as an annuity until the time from when you claim until you die. And that is something that is an important form of insurance, and I'll come back to that as well. So one important thing to think about when you're thinking about how each of these plans affect incentives is just how the benefits are accrued over the life cycle and how that compares to the contributions that are being made over the life cycle. And you can think about Social Security as once you work that 10th year, it's worth a lot because you're now newly eligible for benefits. So that 10th year of work is very valuable. There's also other features of the formula that lead the accruals to be smaller after you've acquired 35 years of earnings. And I'll talk about that more. That is one big difference between defined benefit plans and defined contribution plans, in that the accruals for defined benefit plans tend to be much larger later in one's career and for workers closer to retirement. And so it could be that if you work at a number of firms for 5 years each, you may accrue much less in defined benefit pensions as you would if you had stayed at one firm throughout your career. By contrast, defined contribution plans are much more age neutral in terms of their accrual patterns. So they're better usually for workers that are more mobile across different kinds of firms. There are some tax advantages associated with accruing retirement wealth in each of these 3 different columns. Some Social Security benefits are subject to tax, and we'll come back to that. For defined benefit pensions, the benefits you would receive are subject to income taxes. And for defined contribution plans, your contributions or your earnings from those contributions are usually subject to some tax preferences. Okay, so one thing I want to make sure that I stress is that Social Security is not just a transfer program, or it's not a forced savings program that delivers someone's contributions from their working years back as retirement benefits. It also provides very valuable form of insurance. So you can think of that insurance as coming in different forms. So one is that in addition to retirement benefits, there are of course also benefits that I mentioned that are paid to the survivors. So if the worker dies and has dependents, then these benefits can be quite valuable to those surviving family members, and also those with disabilities who are eligible to receive benefits. There's also a valuable form of insurance through the fact that benefits are indexed to inflation and can therefore help beneficiaries insure against these inflation risks. And, this became kind of more important in recent years as we experienced higher inflation. And we did see the rate of increase in the Social Security benefits also reflect that higher rate of inflation. Finally, another important source of insurance in Social Security is that these benefits are paid monthly until someone dies, which it provides these benefits in the form of a life annuity, and therefore provides a way to insure against the risk of outliving one's savings. So you can never run out of Social Security benefits because they will continue throughout your whole lifetime. I just want to give a few aggregate or just general facts about Social Security.
Yeah.
There are more than 50 million beneficiaries currently receiving retired worker benefits. On average, these benefits are $1,905 each month. Beneficiaries are more likely to be women, and that's because among those eligible to receive Social Security benefits, because life expectancy is longer for women, we see more women represented at older ages in the beneficiary pool. And of course, there's another 2.6 million beneficiaries who are receiving benefits as either spouses or children of retired workers. Social Security is a huge part of the federal budget. It's about 21% currently and scheduled to grow, and that amounts to about 5% of GDP. So for anyone interested in public finance, thinking about how public dollars are allocated, Social Security is just a big part of that. And as I mentioned before, if you think about the participants in the program as not just the people receiving benefits, but also those paying into the system, then that would include the 181 million workers who are employed in some kind of Social Security covered employment and are thus subject to the 12.4% payroll tax. And this payroll tax is also an important tax that people pay. In fact, 2/3 of taxpayers actually pay more in payroll taxes than income taxes. And this is because this tax is actually, it's a flat tax amount that is paid up until a certain earnings amount. In 2024, that amount is $168,800. And it's not progressive at all, meaning that everyone with any earnings below that amount all pay that same 12.4%. And in contrast, the income tax schedule is very progressive. And so that's why we see this figure that 2/3 of taxpayers pay more in payroll taxes than income taxes. So the Social Security Administration puts out every year this annual statistical supplement, which provides a lot of useful statistics about the average benefits received by different groups. They also report these by race and gender, although they do have a note in their statistical supplement saying that there are some concerns about the breakdowns by race due to statistical reliability. But you can see that 1,905 average benefit is higher for men and lower for women. It's also higher among white beneficiaries than it is for Black and other. There's also another 3% of the sample that I'm not showing here where the race is unknown. So another thing that's important to think about is just what is the reliance on Social Security for income in retirement, and how does that vary across the population? So the Social Security Administration used to put out an annual report that reported what share of income Social Security represented, and in particular, different what share of the population relied on Social Security for at least half or 3/4 or 90% of their income in retirement. And the way that they would do this is they ask about income from a lot of different sources in the survey. And so then you can analyze just how big of a share Social Security is of that total income. However, more recent research over the past 5 or 10 years has shown that CPS income data is somewhat unreliable, especially when it comes to elderly households who have pension income. It seems that when we match that survey data to other administrative sources of earnings and income, that then we see a lower share of beneficiaries relying on Social Security as much as we do as compared to the CPS. And so it's a little bit of a problem of how to even report these statistics now, because not anyone can access the CPS merged with these different administrative data sets and calculate accurately this number of what share of the population relies on Social Security for, say, 90% or more. But what this table shows is that if you just use the CPS, the answer to that question would be about 1/4, 25.6%. But if you use the full set of matched data, you would have a very different number. It would be more around 14%. So I think there's still some, I think, open questions of exactly how to accurately represent that given publicly available data. Okay. So the rest of the talk, I want to walk through the ways that retired worker benefits are calculated, talk about how Social Security impacts different kinds of incentives to work and claim benefits, and then end with a few minutes on data sources and research opportunities. Okay, so it starts off simple. We just take someone's earnings history, and we have their earnings in each year that they were working in some form of Social Security covered employment. Okay. After we assemble those that earnings history, we need to apply a wage index to each year of earnings. And the idea there is to say that earnings earned in, say, 1980, we can't compare them apples to apples to earnings from 2020. And so we want to bring the 1980 earnings up to 2020 earnings before we start aggregating those earnings together. Okay. After all of those earnings have been indexed by this average wage index, then we take the 35 highest wage indexed earnings years, and importantly, we include any zeros. So if someone has worked only 30 years, they may have 30 years of indexed earnings, and then they have 5 years of earnings that would just be 0. And if someone earned only 15 years of earnings in Social Security covered employment, they would have 20 years with just zeros in their calculation. And then the last step is very simple. We're just going to take an average amount of those 35 highest years and convert it to a monthly income. And that has an acronym associated with it, which is the average index monthly earnings, or often referred to as the AIME. Okay, so then there's another series of steps, and all of these require a bit more explanation. And so I'm going to spend a slide talking about each of these 4 remaining steps. So the first is to convert the average index monthly earnings, the AIME, to something called a primary insurance amount. Okay. And what you do is you apply essentially this nonlinear formula that has 3 different slopes. And what this formula does is it basically says that for average earnings up to the first bend point, which is $1,174 in 2024, I'm going to replace those earnings at a rate of 90 cents on the dollar. Okay. For any earnings, average earnings between 1174 and 7,078, so basically between bend point 1 and bend point 2, I'm going to replace those earnings at a rate of 32 cents on the dollar. Okay. And finally, for earnings beyond the second bend point up until the maximum, those earnings are replaced at a rate of 15 cents on the dollar. Okay. So this formula basically encompasses all of the progressivity in the program. Okay. So this is providing a higher replacement rate to low levels of average earnings, and as compared to higher levels of average earnings. Okay. And one important thing that I want to note here is that the formula does not distinguish between someone who worked with low levels of earnings throughout their career versus someone who, say, worked for a high level of earnings, but for a shorter career. Okay. Both of those in this formula would have a lower average index monthly earnings and would therefore have a higher replacement rate. Okay. So how does that formula basically result in different levels of benefits as compared to earnings? So if you basically take a few hypothetical people with different levels of earnings throughout their lifetime, okay, and plug them through this formula and let it spit out what their benefits would be, okay? So take someone, for example, the second bar right here, who earned exactly the average wage in each year of their earnings trajectory, and had 35 years of earnings. Just before retirement, this person would have earned about $68,793, and they would be eligible to receive, this is an annual benefit of $25,544. If you take someone who instead earned 160% of the average wage each year, their earnings just prior to retirement would be $110,000. And you can see that their benefits do increase relative to the person who earned the average wage every year, but by not nearly as much as the earnings increase relative to the average earner. Okay. So here, essentially, the red bars don't increase as quickly as the blue bars. And that reflects the fact that higher earners receive a lower replacement rate of their earnings from Social Security. Okay. So once you have the PIA, or the primary insurance amount, this amount can still be adjusted based on when you claim benefits. So the idea here is that if you claim benefits early, you're expected to receive them for a longer number of more years. And so the benefits are adjusted to make them approximately actuarially fair, so that over one's lifetime, you would receive roughly the same amount, whether you claim it earlier rather than later. at a sort of a population level. Okay, for any one person, it may still be very consequential in terms of when to claim because of your actual lifespan. For the 1935 to 36 birth cohort, the full retirement age, the age at which you would earn 100% of your primary insurance amount, was 65. And if you receive benefits earlier, say you claim them at the first age you were eligible, you would instead receive 80% of your benefit, but you would receive them for 3 additional years. Okay. The highest age at which the benefits increase from this delayed retirement credit is age 70. And if you waited until 70, if someone from the 1935 or 36 birth cohort waited until age 70, instead of receiving 100% of their PIA, they would actually receive 130% of their PIA, but they would have received that for 5 fewer years. Okay. This formula has changed over time, both through reforms that affected not just the full retirement age, but also the slope of benefits and the schedule at which the delayed retirement credits are determined. So for the 1943 to 1954 birth cohorts, the full retirement age is 66. This is the age at which you would receive 100% of your PIA. And you can see that at age 70, you would actually receive slightly higher than you would have under the old formula. So this slope is steeper. And now you have to wait to claim benefits until 63 if you wanted to get 80% of your PIA. And then for later birth cohorts, so 1960 and later, the full retirement age is 67. And so you would receive benefits based on where you are along this, this green line. Okay. And one thing I want to note with this formula is that the reform happened where the full retirement age shifted by a year, but you could have come up with an equivalent change in benefits where this whole line just shifts down and say the full retirement age is still 65, but now you calculate it so that instead of receiving 100% of what you would have earned, you receive something more like 93% or 94%. And you could get an equivalent benefit schedule along this orange line through just a benefit reduction. Okay, so essentially you could shift the line to the right or you could shift it down, but you could still end up in the same place. Okay, there's further adjustments for spousal benefits. Worker spouse may be eligible for benefits based on the worker's earnings history. And they would basically receive the maximum of half of the primary earner's PIA or their own PIA, depending on which one is larger. And their benefit would also be adjusted for early or delayed claiming. You could also be in a position where you have earned enough earnings to exceed half of the primary earner's PIA, but you claim the spousal benefits initially, and then you wait and claim your own worker benefits later with an increase for delayed claiming. And that is a strategy that some married couples do. If you are still working and receiving earnings while receiving Social Security benefits, your benefits may be temporarily reduced to reflect different levels of earnings. But one thing that is often misunderstood is that these benefits are not lost permanently. They are actually paid later in the form of higher benefits once you attain the full retirement age. So there's another series of adjustments to benefits. I mentioned before that some portion of Social Security benefits may be subject to income taxes. but only if you have other earnings or combined income, as they call it, above certain thresholds. That threshold was set in 1983 and hasn't changed since then. And so in nominal terms, it's the same amount, which means that more and more beneficiaries are now subject to income taxes as time goes on. I mentioned before that the benefits are adjusted each year with the CPI, and so they do increase with the Consumer Price Index. There is a provision for divorced spouses to receive spousal benefits based on their former spouse's earnings, but only if the marriage lasted at least 10 years. And if the spouse remarries, then this can also change their eligibility for spousal benefits. There's actually quite complicated rules about that I decided to kind of gloss over. At the point where one spouse dies, the surviving spouse would receive the higher primary insurance amount, adjusted for earlier delayed retirement of the primary earner, okay? And so this results in different incentives for claiming for the primary earner versus the secondary earner, and I'll come back to that, because the primary earner's benefit pays until the second spouse dies, whereas the secondary earner's benefit is only paid while both spouses are living. Okay, so now I want to go into talk a little bit more about the economics or the economic impacts of Social Security on different kinds of decisions. But first, it's worth thinking about just what exactly does retirement mean? Because people define it in different ways, and there's not really one correct answer. So on one hand, you could think about retirement as being when you stop working or reduce your earnings. And that could be one measure of retirement is an earnings-based definition. An alternative definition could be based on when someone claims retirement benefits. And those two could be the same time, but they could also be very different. And you'll see that some of the papers that have looked at these kinds of impacts have looked at different margins, and some of them look at a variety of different margins that people might be adjusting. Okay, so we talked about the benefit formula and how it provides different replacement rates at different levels of earnings. And what you see here on the left is a graph that tries to compute what someone's implicit tax rate is, or in other words, how the contributions that are made each year in someone's earnings history compares to the benefits that they are accruing as a result of those contributions. And let's just take the average earner, the solid line right here, as one example. And so what you see is that early in someone's career, the implicit tax rate that they face from Social Security is actually negative. And that's because they're on that part of the line segment where their earnings are being replaced at a rate of 90 cents on the dollar. And that is very generous relative to the contributions that are being paid. And so that actually results in a negative implicit tax rate. Once someone jumps to the segment of the line where instead of a 90% replacement rate, they're subject to a 32% replacement rate, now the tax rate they face is higher, and it gets higher still after someone has completed 35 years of earnings, at which point they're no longer replacing zeros in their benefit calculation. Now their earnings are only counting towards their benefits to the extent that they replace a lower earnings year earlier in their career. Some researchers have used this type of variation in career length and earnings levels to estimate how people respond to different kinds of Social Security incentives. And they find some impact on the extensive margin of retirement, but not as much impact on the intensive margin of how much earnings people are earning. There's also ways that the earnings test could also influence incentives to work while claiming benefits. And researchers have exploited different changes in the earnings tests that have occurred over the last several decades to understand how people respond to these kinds of changes. There's also some work looking at the taxation of benefits, and you can imagine that there's reduced incentive to earn income above certain thresholds if you're already collecting Social Security benefits, because it will lead those benefits to now be subject to income taxes. There's also been some work, and the only papers I found on this topic were kind of from the macro literature, where there were models that were built to kind of relate the fact that if you're a secondary earner, a lot of the contributions you are paying are essentially redundant of benefits you would have gotten anyway because of the spousal benefit that gives you half of your spouse's primary insurance amount as a benefit. And these papers seem to suggest that eliminating those kinds of provisions would increase the labor supply of married women as a result. The changes in the full retirement age and the delayed retirement credit that I showed you in the slopes of those lines that relate claiming age to benefit amount, some of those have been shown to impact the age that people claim. So this is one paper that looks at the effects of changes in the full retirement age. But they also look at earnings, and what they find is no evidence that these changes are influencing earnings, even though they are influencing the claiming age. So you can see here how different margins may respond differently. This is a recent paper that looks at the increase in the delayed retirement credit that occurred over several birth cohorts listed here. And they find that these increases in the delayed retirement credit did lead to an increase in delayed claiming of Social Security benefits among men. But they also find evidence that liquidity constraints appear to play an important role in how responsive people are to these increases, which makes sense. It might be a good deal to delay receiving benefits, and yet if you need those benefits now, you may be less responsive to those kinds of incentives. So there's also work just looking at if people expect to live longer, do they delay claiming also? Because the actuarial adjustment that is made may be quite beneficial for people who expect to live a longer lifespan. And similarly, whether primary workers claim later, holding other factors constant relative to secondary earners. But actually, there's been little evidence that these factors actually influence when people claim. Okay, I think we're pretty good on time. I'm going to spend the last 5 minutes or so talking about different data sources and potential research opportunities. So first, I think there are different data sources that people use to answer some of these questions. And maybe you can think of them in two groups. One is surveys, and one is more administrative sources of data. In terms of surveys, the Health and Retirement Study is a very valuable data source to use to answer a lot of questions about Social Security. It is a biannual panel survey of adults 50 and over, and they survey approximately 20,000 adults every 2 years. And you can link them across different years in the survey. And this also has the ability to link these survey data to some administrative records on earnings from the Social Security Administration through an application for restricted data. Another data source that I want to mention is the Understanding America study. This is an internet panel of households. They are expanding to about 20,000 respondents each year. But one unique feature of this study is that they ask the entire health and retirement study questionnaire to their respondents, but you can also field additional surveys to this panel and link it with all of the results from those other questions that were fielded. And thus, it's an interesting platform to use to investigate issues that are not readily studied with the existing survey data if you wanted to collect your own data. So SSA makes a very limited set of administrative data used for public use. And you can see that these data sets are actually very outdated. And I in fact used the benefits and earnings public use file for my dissertation many, many years ago. And it still doesn't seem to have been updated since then. I was hoping that they had a new version by now. And then the administrative data from Social Security does require special permissions, either a co-author at the Social Security Administration, or sometimes through RDRC projects, you can gain access to different forms of administrative data. And some of the projects that I mentioned, the papers that I mentioned, were actually a result of some RDRC projects that involve the use of administrative data. So Angelina wrote this really nice review article a couple years ago, and every year the RDRC puts out focal areas that they are interested in. And there are certain themes that appear in almost every year of those focal areas for the RDRC. And one of them, I would say, focuses on just communication and outreach about the program. What do people know about the program? How do different types of communities receive information? And the SSA really wants to be able to understand and provide people support in making decisions in the best way possible, and ensuring that these choices reflect full and accurate information. There's also a lot of interest in how different decisions and terminology could impact the choices that people make. So for instance, just how you frame, is it the full retirement age, or is it the normal retirement age? Is it the early age of eligibility or the minimum benefit age? Some of those things can actually have real impacts on how people make decisions. And fielding surveys and hypotheticals could be one way to kind of understand the effects of the ramifications of those kinds of changes. But they're also very interested in how to meet the needs of different demographic groups. And I think that there's a lot to be learned in terms of how these different demographic groups receive information, and what are the trusted sources for different groups. So another recurring theme, and actually overarching theme, for the RDRC is any research related to disparities by race, ethnicity, and sex. And for example, the results that I showed you about the reliance on Social Security that make use of the CPS match to administrative data sources, from what I saw in the paper, did not report these estimates differentially across race and ethnicity. And so that's even just one simple thing that I think needs to be known, is how the reliance on Social Security differs across different groups. But they're also very interested in learning about just what structural barriers influence well-being in retirement. So how does, for example, labor market discrimination then carry over into retirement security, is something that the SSA is very interested in. And there's also a call for more research in terms of best practices to even estimate these disparities and the role of structural barriers. And, just thinking about what is the right things to control for when we're measuring these disparities, and what are the controls that maybe should not be used to get an accurate portrayal of how big those disparities are. So I mentioned the Understanding America study, and part of why I wanted to mention that is because I recently got this email where they're actually looking for proposals to add survey questions, and they have a call. We just missed the most recent one. It was due September 15th, but it looks like they're doing them every quarter. This there's resources from the NIA and SSA to offer free question time to researchers on topics related to inequality and health disparities over the life course. So I think this is one opportunity that could be of use to many of you who are thinking about ways to answer some of the questions that the Social Security Administration has posed in new and creative ways by collecting your own data. Okay, so I just want to end with just one slide looking at the most recent trustees report from the Social Security trustees that talks about just kind of the financial status of the program. And what this shows is basically the costs that are scheduled to be paid as a percent of taxable payroll, and also the revenue that is expected over this time, and how they sort of compare to one another. And as you all probably know, in 2035, that is the point at which the revenues that the program is receiving start to fall short of the benefits that are scheduled to be paid. And if there is no reform until that happens, then some action would need to happen. They can't sort of incur a deficit at that point. And so somehow benefits would have to be reduced to sort of only fall within the level of revenues that are raised. And a lot of the topics that we talked about today, I think, have a lot of importance in how those decisions are made and can inform the way we think about future reforms to the program.
This is great, Gopi. Very helpful. So this is perfect timing also. So there's a few questions in chat that you might want to look at, and a few actually relate directly to your last slide. So I'll let you kind of skim through them and see how you want to address them.
Okay.
And I'm sure people might have some questions they may want to raise live also once you go through those.
Yes, and I've also sent you an email with all those questions in it. So
Okay.
either way, whatever's easiest for you to read.
Great. Let me see. For some reason, not seeing the email that you sent, Gretchen, but I can read it off of oh, there, I see it now.
Yeah, it was just sent 1 second ago.
Perfect. Okay. So slides can be made available, and I believe this whole presentation will be posted as well. So that's an easy question to answer. Okay, so is every employer required to contribute to Social Security for their employees? The answer is yes. The mandatory contributions are both on the worker side as well as the employer side. Both sides are required. And in fact, you might have paid these on your own if you have a nanny that you're paying. You're often subject to pay the employer part of that tax, for example. So this is something that is required among employers as well. Okay, so there was a question about how the different slopes were determined. That is a good question. I don't quite know the answer to that. The slopes have not changed, is my understanding, over the history of the program. I think the way that, say, the bend points were determined, has changed over time, but the basic structure of the 3 different slopes and the actual values for those 3 different slopes, I believe, are the same since the program was initially developed.
Very interesting.
Is that right, Angelina? Is that?
No, that was my question. So I said that's very interesting. Yeah, I was curious, as you were talking through it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that is the case. Okay, so let's see. The next question, it says, Larry Kotlikoff and others have done some work showing that there are suboptimal times for beginning claiming. Is it known whether people are beginning claiming too early relative to when it is optimal? If so, do people with higher PIA tend to begin claiming later? I'm interested in any inequities that arise from the system being as complicated as it appears to be to a non-specialist. I agree with that. There's a lot of complexities that could lead people to make suboptimal decisions. So my sense is that people do often claim early. There's a lot of situations where it might make sense to claim early. So it's difficult to say that all of these people are making some kind of mistake. I have one paper where we tried to see something about these liquidity constraints that people may face. And we used tax records, which have both information about when people are receiving their Social Security benefits, but also some information on the wealth that they may have accumulated in individual retirement accounts. And we do find evidence that it seems to be that people with at least 2 years of Social Security benefits in their retirement accounts are still sometimes claiming early, which does suggest that for some of these people, it might make sense to finance some of that delay by using the money in those retirement accounts, because delaying is often a good. One other thing about the delay, actually, in the delayed retirement credit is those are set by law. And if they were the same all the time, but mortality improves in that people are living longer on average, it would make more and more sense for people to claim later over time. But that's not really what we've been seeing. A lot of people claim right at age 62 when they're first eligible. And I think there are a lot of important questions to be asking about what kinds of inequities that results in. Okay, who decides the policy reform associated with the delayed early claiming formula? So, and how much validity is there to the worries around insolvency of Social Security? Okay, so these are Angelina's questions. So all of the rules about how Social Security benefits are paid, both the full retirement age and the delayed retirement credits, all of those are determined by Congress. The last time that Social Security was reformed was in 1983, so more than 40 years ago, and haven't changed since then. That was a major set of reforms. there was another set of amendments, a few years before that, and the program has been amended several times since it was initially developed in 1933. And then as far as is there validity to the worries about insolvency, I think there definitely are. So, you can think about Social Security as having some features of a defined benefit plan and some features of a defined contribution plan. So the contribution rates are fixed, but also the benefits are fixed. So are those two going to equal every year? It seems like there's a lot of scope for some assumptions to change that could lead those to be out of balance. We've had a lot of changes in the demographics of the US population. So as fertility rates go down, for example, it becomes harder to support the number of retirees with the number of workers. And that is one sort of trend that has happened. Also, on average, people are living longer, and that also results in more retirees relative to workers paying into the program. Okay.
A quick follow-up, by the way, Gopi. When
Yeah.
people say insolvency, is it that point you showed us in the last chart that they're talking about, or really? I mean, that's what I imagine people mean, right? Or is there even, disagreement over what insolvency means?
Yeah, I think insolvency is usually discussed as the time at which you can no longer pay the amount of benefits that are scheduled to be paid. And that point, it can change from trustee report to trustee's report, but it's somewhere in the 2034, 2035 range at the moment. If anything, that might be somewhat optimistic, because there are some who contend that the assumptions that Social Security uses in their trustees report are somewhat optimistic as well. And so that date at which the program is insolvent, it doesn't mean that it completely goes away at that point. It just means that it can't pay 100% of the benefits it's supposed to be paying. Okay, so I think we covered the next one as well. And there's sometimes bills and legislation and solutions under consideration, but not seriously. There hasn't been really a serious conversation about Social Security reform in quite some time. And in fact, sometimes it's sort of the opposite, which is that politicians are saying that they won't change anything about Social Security benefits. And that kind of cuts off a lot of possible discussion about what can happen to make the program solvent again. In terms of analyzing reform, could you speak to conducting research on incremental improvements to the system vis-a-vis conducting research on major overhauls, perhaps using the Better Managed Systems Worldwide as a guide? So I think there is a lot that we can learn from other countries who almost every developed country has a program like Social Security. Of course, the benefit is different. The eligibility might be different. The way retirement benefits, whether there's a delayed retirement credit, or all of those could be very different. But the experience in other countries can prove valuable when thinking about how responsive people could be to different changes. I think it's always difficult to project what might happen in the wake of a big Social Security reform. It's even hard to sometimes examine the impacts of Social Security reforms just because it applies to everyone. And there's not really a control group of people who are not affected. And so sometimes you have to look for these small changes in the formula that affect this group slightly differently than this group. And that does limit, I think, what we can learn from those kinds of studies. And they may or may not apply to big changes in the program that may be considered. And I think that is an important point caveat to a lot of the research is that they're often identified off of small changes to the program and may not apply to a big change.
Thank you, Gopi. So we are literally at 3 p.m. and I know you have a few more minutes if need be, but I know some folks will probably start dropping off. Are there any last, one last question that's burning that anyone has they want to ask live? Gerald, go on.
Hi, Gopi. I'm Gerald at Howard University. I'm just curious, now that we're having this housing crisis, right, and this is another issue that might be facing Social Security recipients, how are these discussions being related to the time in which people are taking out their roots to, let me say this, the time that they are trying to withdraw their benefits, right? So as you mentioned before, liquidity may be an issue, and this is an additional liquidity constraint. And since the data is so old, which probably doesn't reflect the last 16 years of extremely high housing prices, one would anticipate that people are withdrawing their benefits earlier due to these higher housing prices and rent prices, so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, housing wealth is another important form of wealth that a lot of older Americans have access to. Of course, a lot of older Americans don't have access to that, and how liquid it is and how it influences claiming behavior. I think it's a really interesting question that I don't think that I've seen really any research on that. But that could be a really important area for research, is how changes in housing equity affect different decisions as they relate to Social Security.
Also, great presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah, this was great. All right, folks, so maybe that's a good place to put a pin in it. Thanks again, Gopi. This was very illuminating and a great way to kick us off with our webinar series. So again, this will be posted on the RDRC website at some point, particularly under the resources tab. So we look forward to seeing you at our next set of workshops. If you are not on our mailing list, reach out to me or reach out to confer@nber.org, the conference department, and we will get you on the list. All right, everyone, enjoy your weekend. Take care.
Thank you.
See you.
Thank you.